The report, called Our Generational Vision for Justice and Liberation, written by the Terence Crutcher Foundation, is a love letter to our community.
In 2020, the Terence Crutcher Foundation conducted an analysis of Tulsa's racial inequalities in justice and economic mobility.
We decided to educate our community on the role that race and racism plays as it relates to the criminal legal system, and also the economic impact that it's had on communities of color. We propose an initial set of strategies and recommendations to help transform our communities so we get to define what safety looks like in our own community. In our generational vision for justice and liberation, I can't help but think about Terence Crutcher Jr., the namesake of our organization. And I think about his future 30 years from now. I think about the side of the tracks and that line right here in Greenwood where Terence Crutcher Foundation, where our offices sit. I think about those railroad tracks that 100 years ago delineated white Tulsa from Black Tulsa, and I envision that line, that racial divide being erased, where Terence will be able to walk outside free and not have to live in a food desert. I envision little Terence Jr. being able to go to a school that's full of resources and abundance. I envision little Terence being able to play outside with a toy gun and not be killed at the hands of law enforcement because he's deemed a super predator. I imagine Terence being able to drive around in his car and get his driver's license and not be pulled over and handcuffed because of the color of his skin. I imagine little Terence being able to sit on his sofa and eat a bowl of ice cream and not be killed because he was simply minding his business. I imagine Terence Jr. not having the same fate as his father, where he's able to be in crisis and get the help that he desires and that he deserves and not be deemed a bad dude. That is the type of world, that is the type of community that I envision for Terence Jr. and everyone, every little boy and every little girl who looks like him. That is our generational vision for justice and liberation.
They had two main goals. First, learning how the criminal legal system economically impacts the lives of Tulsans, particularly Black, brown, and low-income communities, and how to make structural changes to transform that system. And second, to explicitly talk about the role that race and racism play in the system so that solutions focus on liberation for BIPOC communities. This report summarizes their findings and shares their analysis of the root causes and impacts of mass incarceration and economic privation in Tulsa.
Our analysis was grounded in the historical, cultural, and political context of Oklahoma, and also grounded in the wisdom and the scholarship of abolitionists, women like Andrea Ritchie and Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba. We also facilitated interviews and we talked to community leaders, activists, organizers, elected officials, and allowed them to share with us what their plan and their vision is for our community. And we also talked to, most importantly, the people who's been hardest hit by this system.
However, to achieve their generational vision of justice for their communities, we must understand the community's histories, the context and status of the criminal legal system in Oklahoma, and the state of economic mobility among communities hardest hit by that system. On the centennial of the worst incident of racial violence in U.S. history, the Terence Crutcher Foundation occupies an office that looks directly onto two of the most enduring symbols of racial division in Tulsa: the railroad tracks that have segregated the city since before statehood, and I-244, which is ironically named Martin Luther King Jr. Expressway, which tore through what was left of historic Greenwood district toward the end of their urban renewal in the 1970s. When they envision a racially just, economically mobile future, they see a Tulsa where the side of the tracks a child is born doesn't determine whether they grow up in unsafe neighborhoods with constant presence of police cars, or go to schools where metal detectors and resource officers are a fixture, or learn in classrooms where teachers assume they're up to no good and must leave their family and community for quality educational and job opportunities. Their dream for Tulsa is one where neighbors know and support one another. Conflict and crisis are rare and taken care of within the community, and everyone has their needs met because resources are abundant and shared. Most importantly, their vision for Tulsa is one where currently oppressed communities have autonomy over their lives and their futures, instead of state actors, external service providers, or outside entities.
In order to get to where we need to go, it is critical that we understand this from a lens and a context of the people who basically lived, built, birthed, struggled throughout the whole entire journey of Black Oklahomans. I mean, it's really critical for America to understand this American story and the journey in getting here. You know, going through the process of being bought and sold and in the South, antebellum South, and coming into Oklahoma via the Trail of Tears and what that experience is like. Just the fact that that history is omitted from historical context is critical to understand, because it's one of the most shocking parts of the journey. Then to get to Oklahoma and to acquire your freedom in 1866. And what that gave birth to was a new experience for Black people in the state of Oklahoma who saw great opportunity, right? Like, now we can finally be free. We've already built a nation for free. What are the possibilities? You know, we can build townships and villages and trade routes. We can do anything imaginable, right? Which leads us to Tulsa, where you have now the promised land, the dreamland. And you have this Mecca, this institution, this entrepreneurial, enterprising community that says now we can take the best of who we are and build a magnificent community like nothing we've ever seen, nothing the world has ever seen. And so this unboundedness that these people experienced was short-lived, but it's been the greatest example of what uninterrupted progress could look like when people have a healthy environment in which to exist in and to branch off and explore your own humanity.
In their multi-year study of Black Wall Street published in 2021, the New York Times did a deep dive into the devastation caused by the race massacre. Hundreds of lives were taken, dozens of businesses destroyed, and over 1,000 homes burned down in a matter of hours. In a 2001 Oklahoma State Commission report, the financial toll of the massacre in 1921 of $1.8 million equated to roughly $16.5 million. Adjusted for inflation today, that total equated to $27 million in 2021, 100 years after the massacre. The destruction of property is only one piece of the financial devastation that the massacre brought. Much bigger is a sobering kind of inheritance, the incalculable and enduring loss of what could have been, and the generational wealth that might have shaped and secured the fortunes of Black children and grandchildren for decades to come.
Had this not been erased from history books, it is unimaginable what could have happened in the mind of a Black child in school who says, you know, they did things against remarkable odds. Who am I to say I can't? When we think about Greenwood and the experience that happened in the Greenwood district, AKA Black Wall Street, you deal with a number of things. You deal with epigenetics, you know, that process of how people carry on traumas and certain events in their physical being, and how that manifests not just in a physical manner, but even in a mental manner. And you can feel the energy. When you come to Tulsa, you come into the Black community, you can still feel that, you feel both hope and despair all at the same time, almost in an equal balance.
That disparity is especially felt in the life expectancy of predominantly Black areas of Tulsa. In a 2015 report done by the Tulsa Health Department, statistics showed that in predominantly Black zip codes in Tulsa, the life expectancy was 69 years old, while across town in predominantly white zip codes, the life expectancy jumped up to 80 years.
So we start to see these parallels and how these things manifest themselves. Another good example, the murder of Terence Crutcher. If you look at photos from the massacre, you will see men with their hands up being marched to Convention Hall, McNulty Park, the fairgrounds. The image of that, epigenetics, the image of that, especially with her family, with Dr. Crutcher's family being of descendants, Terence Crutcher himself being a descendant. The idea of hands up in the middle of the street and then you're shot is a serious parallel that people haven't even begun to understand, but the city understands it. In a city like this, it is a powder keg, and Tulsa will burn, could potentially burn as a result of what has been witnessed nationwide. The city of Tulsa knew that. How do you prevent that? You create an illusion that we're gonna handle this. Just like in 1921, we're gonna pay for what we did. Nothing ever happened. Not a dime was ever spent to help rebuild Greenwood. Not a dime has been spent to repair what happened with Terence Crutcher. Same exact scenario.
I think sometimes we think about the race massacre as simply a violent act that costed lives, which it did, but it was also a form of economic terror that destroyed the businesses that existed, but also destroyed the ability for all of those innovators to continue doing what they were on the pathway and in the midst of doing. When you look at the numbers, the number of patents that occurred during the time of real racial violence and racial terror in the 1910s and 20s, it dips dramatically after that period for Black people. And so the wealth gap is something that is not bred overnight. It has been caused by a series of policies, and it's something that was intentionally made, right? So then when you combine that with another system that has been with us for far too long and in far too detrimental a way, the carceral system, you begin to see these gears doing the same things that those inherently racist policies of before were doing.
While evidence of inequality is plentiful, there is less consensus on the root causes of these disparities. Are they a result of disparaging behavior by communities of color, or disparaging treatment by the institutions within and around the criminal legal system? When a Massachusetts State Supreme Court justice commissioned a study to answer this question in their state, Harvard Law School's conclusion was consistent. Racism within the system accounted for all measurable disparities. As they are in Oklahoma, Black and Latinx people are overrepresented in Massachusetts criminal caseloads, sentencing type, severity, and duration.
There is endless data, really grows and grows and grows of research and reports that have been done, including our report, showing the racial disparities within the carceral system, within the criminal justice system, that proves that a more appropriate name for the criminal justice system is the criminal injustice system, or the criminal legal system, because what we have come to find out through all of the research and through all of the data is that our criminal legal system is far more unequal and unjust than it is equal and just, as it often purports to be. So the carceral state is this concept that looks at the sort of wide-ranging scope of various systems and institutions that are seen and unseen in visible and invisible ways that interact to create our society that prioritizes policing and incarceration and criminalization, that prioritizes punishment over care and resources for our community. The carceral state is a tool of social control. It is a way to control and exploit and enact violence upon communities for a specific reason, for the reason of upholding a social hierarchy, a hierarchy that continues to divide and place historically marginalized communities at the bottom of that hierarchy.
Human Rights Watch used Tulsa as a case study in 2019 to conduct a similar analysis focused specifically on race and policing, and concluded that, quote, Black people, even regardless of wealth or poverty, disproportionately receive aggressive treatment by police, end quote. As a result, they found that Black leaders reported that fear of police and experience of mistreatment by police are facts of life in their communities.
And so we have sort of this conceptualization within the report of the carceral state as three icebergs that tries to capture the very broad, wide, and omnipresent force that is the carceral state in our lives. And these three pillars of the carceral state are criminalization, surveillance, and confinement. And so if you think about this model of the iceberg, you've often seen the visible part that is above water and the invisible part that is below water that we can't see, that is below sea level, right? And this is a good way to think about the carceral state, because what the concept of the carceral state does is that there are visible forms of the carceral state that we see in the institution of policing, right? That we see in the physical sites of jails, in prisons, detention centers, right? There are the courts, probation officers, things of this nature that are very, very visible forms, right, of the carceral state. But there are also sort of more insidious, and it's insidious because of how invisible and sort of unbeknownst to the everyday citizen or resident, the ways that they also function as a form of carcerality, as a form of confinement and criminalization and surveillance. And these sort of more invisible tools of the carceral state are attitudes and ways of thinking that really do influence the policies, practices, and procedures that reinforce the carceral state. And so it is really like a never-ending cycle that reinforces these ideas around law and order, around crime and criminality, around dehumanizing certain communities, around fear mongering and things of that nature, that are these deeply rooted sort of attitudes and narratives that create and continue to sort of bolster up the more visible forms of incarceration and policing and surveillance. There's a great quote that says that policing and incarceration do not disappear social problems, they disappear people, right? That's what the carceral state does. It has a problem and it seeks to hide it, to take it from a community and put it behind a cage, put it behind some bars, put it in a concrete box, right? But that tomorrow that person gets out, that problem is still there. That goes for violence, that goes for homelessness, that goes for mental illness. And so where our priorities really need to be is in providing resources in the same communities that have been resource deprived for centuries.
Hyper-policing, acting essentially as economic predation in communities, it breaks down as such. I am taken out of a community. I'm stripped of my ability to build wealth, being locked up, right? Yet when I am locked up, I am providing free labor, right? It exists when you see the fact that you do something that is a finable offense, right? And yet that finable offense in itself becomes a trap. You cannot get out of that cycle because you were poor when you did the thing that got you in trouble, right? The fines then begin to pile on. You can't pay those. And so the answer for not paying fines is getting more fines, right? And so now you get into a cycle. You are entrapped within this system. It is essentially what can be called a debtor's prison. And you see that in the numbers and the way that that's laid out in this report. Ultimately, the picture that the data is painting for us currently is that while we know that economic mobility should be the pathway out of poverty, we have systems put in place, namely and foremost the carceral system, that are actually acting against the ability for us to move upward economically, and actually just perpetually putting too many impoverished families in that same position generation after generation.
Further, schools in poor, hyper-policed, under-resourced communities not only funnel children into the prison industrial complex, but have become sites of incarceration themselves. Children are taught to be orderly, stand in single file lines, dress identically, wait for the bell to ring, listen to the intercom, not speak unless spoken to, and conform to strict behavioral expectations that emphasize grit and character development. Breaking any of these rigid rules results in swift punishment, like social penalties, confinement and isolation from peers, interrogation by school resource officers, even referrals to law enforcement. The parallels to prison culture reveal how school buildings serve as a locus of the carceral state through criminalization, surveillance, and confinement.
Another way that the carceral state services in the education system is in the resources that are stripped from schools in Black communities, right, and Latino communities. And it is really because so much money, so much funding, so much emphasis is on the carceral system, is on punishment, surveillance, criminalization, that the funding for the education system, funding for providing basic necessities to students and their parents, to families, to teachers, aren't there, right? It really is a one-to-one, right? We continue to fund the juvenile justice system and cages for kids, and we're not funding the classrooms. We're not funding the teachers inside of them.
The carceral state directly impacts economic mobility within BIPOC communities, particularly in Black neighborhoods. The system extracts wealth from communities by removing individuals through incarceration, typically during the most productive years, and using their labor in prisons. Fees and fines also trap poor Tulsans in a cycle of debt and criminalization.
Unfortunately, right now, when we look at the data, what we see is that twice as many people of color, African Americans, Latinos, are being impacted by not the income wealth gap, but the wealth gap when we talk about the ability to collect assets. That's what wealth is really about. And so currently, 13% of white families fall below what we call the liquid asset gap, whereas 26% of Black families fall below that line.
Tulsa's advocacy landscape is burgeoning yet fractured. In the absence of a strong organizing infrastructure to activate, advocates expend a lot of time and energy attempting to forge the necessary relationships, identify resources, create communication channels, and build trust, all while addressing the challenge at hand, building the proverbial plane while flying it. When these efforts fail to change to policies they were hoping to affect, the energy quickly dissipates and advocates are left exhausted and demoralized.
We really have lacked a strong, durable organizing ecosystem and infrastructure here in Tulsa and in Oklahoma for a variety of reasons. First of all, I think a lot of times issues are symptomatically addressed in our community, and that is due to how funds are usually operating and used through philanthropy and donors. A lot of people try to address the symptoms that we see rather than the root causes. And so because of that, we've had a lot of on and off organizing efforts that have kind of ballooned and been relevant for a short period, but have never really been able to be sustained. Like we've seen state questions, those are kind of heightened organizing responses, or elections, but never have we seen a sustained force of organizers that have the real the infrastructure behind them.
There are historical and cultural reasons for this. Past efforts to build power among marginalized groups in Oklahoma were violently tamped out, from the Green Corn Rebellion to the 1921 Tulsa Massacre.
A lot of times the nonprofits and philanthropy are often addressing the symptoms of the issues we see. A lot of organizations are really encouraged and really discouraged to engage in advocacy. They're encouraged to kind of do services, really produce numbers. I've fed this many people, I've housed this many people, I've addressed this symptom, and are often discouraged from really using their voice or elevating a position on a certain issue politically or publicly, and out of fear of losing their funding. I mean, I've seen that a lot in Tulsa, I've seen that a lot in Oklahoma, and that is what continues to create, this culture of like respectability, or I will only go so far, or the feeling of paternalism from the philanthropic industrial complex, really feeling like your funders are going to control what you can and can't say and water down your mission. But there are organizations that now don't really, fit the mold anymore and are willing to speak out and are willing to advocate and have funders that encourage that, because we know that that's how we're going to really solve the issues we see in this report and beyond, is really get at the root of what's causing these power imbalances in our community, what's causing these issues, and how do we really shift power and shift the dynamics that are causing these issues to begin with.
The purpose of community organizing is to build collective power to make change. Organized power ensures that community members can practice self-determination over matters that impact them. They have a seat at the decision-making tables that govern them, and they are equipped to activate around opportunities in crisis when necessary. Organizing requires building infrastructure, developing knowledge and skills, and growing capacity.
One of the reasons we focus on organizing as a tool to create generational change is because it brings all of those silos together to identify different pathways and interests that we can collaboratively work towards. It forces us to build infrastructure. It forces us to develop skills within ourselves and within our broader community. And it forces us then to build capacity in order to have the amount of power, right? Have the amount of buy-in from across the community to create the type of change that the community wants to see. That means that ultimately, to organize effectively and with a broad impact, you've got to have an ecosystem. You've got an organizing ecosystem that is built kind of like a hubs and spokes model. It isn't just one organization or one mindset guiding everything. It's actually a cumulative impact. There's a lot of different people and organizations that are working in their own lanes, but then are able to come together and do things that are impacting our community as a whole. And that is the model that you're gonna see laid out in this report.
When we think about safe communities, there are so many different systems that must change in order to really give our community members and our neighbors the autonomy and self-determination that they need in order to stay safe. But we also have to understand that the carceral state is not just a system, it's a mindset that has been induced into us ever since the beginning of this country.
Safety is the ability for all people in communities and in our society to live, to breathe, to grow, and thrive with the freedom from violence and the freedom to do anything and everything that they want. Safety, importantly, is different than the safety that the criminal legal system purports to provide to our people and to our society. At the Terence Crutcher Foundation and in this report, we really try to differentiate between public safety and community safety. This public safety is bound up and tied in a really strong narrative with policing, with confinement, and with surveillance, right? But community safety identifies that safety within our communities, within communities that are well-resourced, that have street lights, right? That have strong networks and relationships with one another, where they are really able to engage in fruitful and critical conversations, where accountability is the norm, and where the police no longer harass and ravage our communities.
Safe neighborhoods are sanctuaries from state and interpersonal violence. In safe neighborhoods, residents share in the responsibility to protect one another without relying on the carceral state. These are not conflict-free utopias, but instead places where residents practice community accountability and transformative justice, relying on themselves and intra-community assets to address harm. Successful safe neighborhoods reduce trauma and violence and increase repair and healing. Safe schools prioritize relationships between students, parents, teachers, and administrators. They incorporate transformative processes for accountability and cut ties entirely with the institution of policing. Safety in schools does not come by way of metal detectors and surveillance cameras, but rather through a crucial paradigm shift holding care for students' well-being above all else.
So what does it take to make safe schools? I think that just like restorative justice and transformative justice, it actually requires for us to have a safe education system. And for Black and brown children, our education system is not safe for them. We believe that every extreme behavior has a need behind it that's being unmet. So how can we as a community come around and support that kid to make sure that they have what they need? Because I believe when kids have what they need, they succeed and they thrive. We talk about police-free schools, and it doesn't require a lot of imagination to see that. We just have to go to the suburbs and see how they're doing their schools and how safe it is for them and how they have divested from control and more make sure that every student has what they need. There's the example right there. Why is it not happening in our neighborhoods? Why is it not happening in our communities? Because of the fear of the cultural expressions that our kids are expressing for just being who they are.
Once the community power, community safety, and narrative change pillars are engaged, organizers, advocates, and leaders can effectively collaborate on advancing a shared policy agenda. Oklahoma's unenviable role as one of the world's top incarcerators is no accident. It is the natural result of an aggressively punitive cultural environment that props up the carceral state based on the flawed belief that we can punish our way out of harm. But there is another way. We can build a different kind of community where accountability looks like restoration and healing, power is held and shared by the people, and Oklahomans think and talk about safety in expansive ways.
The Crutcher Foundation has chosen intentionally to center organizing as its core strategy to create change. And you can already see the impact that the Crutcher Foundation is having. The ability to convene and gather organizations from across the city and to center and focus our efforts on things that are going to move this community forward is already having an impact. And so when we think about what the Crutcher Foundation is looking to do next, it's about expanding that footprint, expanding the ability to impact the city more and more. And that's going to take more staff. It's going to take more resources, more of an ability to put more investment where the Crutcher Foundation has already shown that this formula that they're using works.
With this strategy, with this vision, how do we bring it to life? And there's a solution, there's a way. In the Terence Crutcher Foundation, because of the tragic killing of my twin brother, his blood has been a catalyst for change. It's been a force for good. And we know that it's gonna take people coming together. It's gonna take the Terence Crutcher Foundation being the backbone organization that it is, to be the heartbeat, to galvanize people, to galvanize grassroots organizations, community leaders, faith leaders, to galvanize people who care about the issues, who care about the change, who care about our children, who care about our future, coming together to disrupt these systems. And we have a plan for that change, and we believe that it's going to take catalytic investment into organizations like ours, into organizations like the Black Mental Health Alliance, into organizations like the Black Wall Street Times, to make sure that we get to control our narrative and tell our stories our way. It's going to take that investment. It's going to take the time. It's going to take the effort. It's going to take the energy. It's going to take the people power to get us to that vision. And we know that this vision is rooted in the principles of our founders, Reverend Joey Crutcher and the late Leanna Crutcher, who instilled agape love in us. Everything we do, is founded on that one principle, and that's love.